everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from England when the body of a murdered young woman was discovered dumped in a ditch in late 1993. An investigation was launched by the police in an effort to apprehend her killer. However, due to a real lack of evidence, the case went cold and the victim and her family were left with no closure and no justice. And then, just a couple of months later, the same thing seemed to happen again. In an area close by, the body of a second woman was found, forcing the police and the public to consider whether they'd been killed by the same individual. Did they have a serial killer on their hands? Well, the answer to that question would come years and years later when a DNA hit ultimately led the police to the identity of the murderer. A twisted and perverted sexual predator who seemed to carry out these crimes due to his hatred of all women, leading people to question if his victim toll actually stopped at 2. Join me as we delve into the chilling case of the Midlands Ripper. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a big thank you to Huel for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Huel are a brand that makes healthy alternatives to on-the-go food, and recently I've been really enjoying their hot and savoury pots. Life has been quite hectic for me recently, I'm not gonna lie. I feel like I've got so much going on. I'm here, there and everywhere at the minute, and I cannot tell you how much easier Huel have made meal times for me with their hot and savoury pots for when I don't have time to spend like an hour cooking in the evenings. They're super easy to make. They literally take about 5 minutes, so it's so convenient. They come in 6 different noodle and pasta flavours. My personal favourite is their pasta bolognese, would highly recommend. And the best part, they are actually super good for you, unlike a lot of other easy to go foods that you see in the shop. Huel's hot and savoury pots are packed full with all of the nutrients that you need. They contain vitamin C to help support your immune system, vitamin B12 which reduces tiredness and fatigue. They are a source of calcium. They have the right amount of protein, up to 22 grams per pot, essential fats, carbohydrates, fibre and all of the vitamins and minerals that your body requires as part of a balanced diet. Huel's hot and savoury pots have 0 artificial colours or flavourings. They are plant-based and super affordable too, with prices starting at just £3.05 per pot. So if you would like to give them a go yourself, then right now is the time to do it, because Huel are very kindly offering my lovely viewers a discount. For my UK viewers, you can receive £10 off when you spend a minimum of £60, and my US viewers can receive 15% off when you spend $75. All you have to do is head to Huel's website, which is linked at the top line of the description box, or you can scan the QR code that is on the screen and use the code Mollie. And this offer is only for a limited time, so be quick. Thank you so much once again to Huel for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you as always to all of you guys watching for showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault, including the sexual assault of a minor. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 32 years ago now to late 1993 in the county of Leicestershire, which is located in the East Midlands area of England. Specifically, our case begins in a little village in Leicestershire called Swinford. It was the 31st of December, New Year's Eve of 1993, when a horse rider trotting along this quiet country road just outside of Swinford made a shocking discovery. She was riding her horse when she happened to look into the ditch on the side of the road, and that was when she spotted what she believed at first was a dummy, a mannequin, but she was wrong. It wasn't a mannequin. She'd actually found the dead, partially nude body of a young woman. And so stunned, the horse rider immediately contacted the police and officers were dispatched to the scene. Of course, given the location that she was found in, this ditch along a quiet rural road, it didn't take long for the police to conclude that foul play had most likely been involved in this poor woman's death. It seemed like her body had been hidden here in the hopes that she would never never be found, and she almost wasn't. Due to the state of decomposition, police could tell that she had been dead for some time. She'd probably been in this ditch for some time, but no one had found her because, again, it was a rural road, but also it was December. There had been some snowfall, so she'd been covered over. Occasionally, this ditch would also be filled with water, so she was covered with water. And actually, the only reason the horse rider was able to spot her was because of the fact that she was on a horse. Her body was quite low down in this ditch, so someone just walking or driving along the road probably wouldn't have seen her there. But because this woman was high up on a horse, she did see her. And I mean, thank God that she did, because who knows how much longer she would have been there had she not. The woman was lying face down in the ditch. Her body was quite frozen, actually, as it was December. It was freezing outside. As I said, she was partially nude. I believe the only thing that she was wearing was a short white top, and a post-mortem would later confirm what the police believed. She had, in fact, been murdered. It was determined that this poor woman, whoever she was, had been strangled to death. And unfortunately, I think the police knew right from the off that, my God, this crime was going to be a difficult one to solve, because again, right from the off, they didn't really have much to go on. They knew that obtaining any sort of evidence was going to be near enough impossible. They didn't find any items or objects at the scene in or around the ditch that seemed to be relevant to the murder, like, for example, a ligature or tyre marks from the killer's vehicle. It was clear that she had to have been transported to this location as it was so out of the way. But yeah, they didn't find any tyre tracks. Forensics wise, again, nothing was found. Scientists were unable to find any fingerprints or DNA belonging to the killer on her body because, I mean, she'd been exposed to the elements. She had been partially submerged in water, so any evidence like that would have just been washed away. Given the rural location, there was obviously no CCTV cameras nearby. There were also no houses, so it wasn't like police could speak to local residents asking if they had seen or heard anything. They literally had virtually nothing to go on. I guess all they could hope was that once they'd identified this victim, maybe they could identify someone in her life as being a potential suspect. The woman in the ditch was eventually identified as being 20-year-old mother of one, Samo Poole. She was originally from the West Midlands, actually. She vanished from an area called Balsall Heath in Birmingham in the West Midlands, which is a good, like, 39 miles away from Swinford, where her body was found. Like I said, Samo was a mother, a single mother. She had a daughter named Viella, who was just 8 months old when her mother was killed. And Samo also had a partner, a boyfriend, who she and her daughter lived with, and her partner was actually the one who reported her as missing. It turns out that Samo had vanished nearly an entire month before her body was found. She was last seen on the evening of the 4th of December 1993, and as we know, she was found on the 31st of December. That night, the night of the 4th of December, Samo left her home. She left her boyfriend and her daughter Viella to go to the red light district in Balsall Heath. You see, prior to her death, Samo had been working as a sex worker. She was a single mother struggling for money, and this was how she had started trying to provide for her child. And so yeah, on the evening of the 4th, that was exactly what she had been doing. She'd gone to the red light district in search for clients. However, she never returned. She never returned back home. She was last seen alive in the red light district. So now it was looking like her killer was probably someone who had picked her up that night. He pretended that he wanted sex from Samo, but instead he ended up murdering her and driving her body to that ditch in Leicestershire. Having said that, her boyfriend was also looked into by detectives when her body was found. He was looked at quite extensively as a suspect, actually, but eventually he was more or less ruled out of the police's inquiries. He really was looking after Samo's daughter at home that night. He had nothing to do with her death. And I mean, apart from him, there weren't really any other prime suspects. The police did try to look into men that were known to use sex workers in the Balsall Heath area, but of course this was tricky because most clients, I imagine, probably try to keep it quite quiet that they pay for those kinds of services, so it was hard to actually find those men. They also considered whether the perpetrator may have been a worker who was employed to help develop the A14 road, because that was being constructed at the time of Samo's murder, not far from where her body was found. found, so a big theory was that maybe her killer was one of those construction workers who would often drive along the roads to and from Birmingham and Leicestershire. But I mean, the issue was, even if the police did become suspicious of one of these men in particular, or one of these sex worker clients, they didn't actually really have anything to be able to link them to the crime due to, again, a lack of evidence in Samo's case. They had no DNA, they had no surveillance footage, they had no witnesses. Well, apart from one, it seemed, whilst the police didn't have much information to go on in Samo's case at all, there was one tip that came in following the discovery of Samo's body, which they believed may have been significant. It was reported by a woman, and she claimed that on the 7th of December 1993, so just 3 days after Samo was last seen alive, she was, I think, either walking or driving down the same country lane outside of Swinford where Samo's body was later discovered, and she recalled seeing this brown-coloured Ford Sierra car driving past her. Inside the car, the woman saw a man was driving, and there was also a woman in the car too. However, she was actually sitting in the back seat. She was described as sitting, quote, bolt upright, and she had what looked like some strange marks on her face, and chillingly, she actually thought at the time that this woman in the back seat looked like she was dead. You see, as the car drove around a corner, the witness noticed that the woman in the back kind of slumped over a bit, and the witness had actually previously worked in a pathologist's office, so she was very used to seeing and dealing with dead bodies. And yeah, she just remembered thinking at the time, that woman in the back seat looks like she is deceased. And what also stood out to the witness was that the man who was driving the car was very, very clearly trying to hide himself. As he drove by, the witness noticed that he tried to pull this hat over his face so that he wouldn't be seen. So, of course, this all seemed incredibly suspicious, made this woman very, very worried. However, she didn't actually report this to the police at the time. Apparently, she went home and she told her family what she had seen, and they appeared to just kind of brush it off, make her think that she was probably just mistaken, and so she didn't go to the authorities. That was until about 3 weeks later, when she saw on the news that the body of Samo Poole had been found on that same road, and she literally thought, oh my god, that's the woman that I saw. When she saw a picture of Samo, she was actually certain that the woman she'd seen in the back seat of the brown Ford Sierra was her, and now she'd been found dead, found strangled. It seemed like those strange marks the witness noticed on Samo's face were likely burst blood vessels from where she had been strangled. So yeah, following the discovery of Samo's body, the woman finally reported this sighting to the police. So now the police kind of had their first big lead in the case. They believed that Samo's killer probably drove a brown Ford Sierra. And there was also another potentially significant lead that came in. I believe around the time that Samo went missing, a member of the public reported to the police that they had seen a kind of struggle going on between a man and a woman in the Borsal Heath area, where it looked as though the man was trying to force this woman into a vehicle. He was literally trying to drag her into the vehicle. The witness described the vehicle as being a brown-coloured car, similar to the car that the previous witness described, and they were even able to tell the police the first 3 letters or numbers of the license plate. They could remember the first 3 digits. So with this information, police began inquiries to try and find this car, look into people who owned a brown-coloured Ford Sierra. However, unfortunately, not much really came of this, and as time passed, the case of Samo Poole just kind of went cold. It was being handled by the West Midlands police, because although her body was found in the East Midlands, she obviously vanished in the West Midlands. So police decided to focus their inquiries more so on that area. They specifically just kind of focused on the Borsal Heath area where she was last seen. But yeah, eventually the West Midlands police just reached a bit of a standstill in the case, and it remained unsolved. And then, only about 3 months after the murder of Samo Poole, came the shocking news that the body of another young woman had just been found, again in Leicestershire. It was the morning of the 3rd of March 1994 when a member of the public was walking their dog along this quiet country road in the village of Bitterswell in Leicestershire, only about 5 miles away from Swinford where Samo was found. They were walking their dog along this road when they found a woman's body just dumped on the roadside, and so they called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they observed that the body was lying face up. She was lying on her back and she wasn't really decomposed at all, so she'd obviously only recently died. And they later received information that she'd only been put there probably under an hour or two before she was found. You see, unlike Samo, this second woman's body wasn't that hidden. She wasn't in a ditch or anything. I think she was literally just on the side of the road. Now, she was found by the dog walker at around 7 a.m. that morning, but 2 hours before that, at around 5 a.m, a couple of people reported that they had walked down that same road and they didn't see her. So yeah, she had to have only been left very, very recently, somewhere in that 2-hour gap. Just like Samo, this woman had also been strangled to death. It actually appeared as though she had been strangled from behind with some kind of ligature, because she had a lot of scratches around her neck and under her chin where it looked as though this woman had been pulling at the ligature trying to free herself. She was naked when she was found, suggesting that the motive for her murder was most likely sexual, which was later confirmed when the autopsy revealed that she had tragically been the victim of rape. And thankfully, the police had more luck in this case than they did in Samo Paul's case in terms of finding evidence at the crime scene. You see, next to where this second woman's body was on the roadside, police spotted some fresh tyre tracks in the mud. So they made a cast of these tracks, believing that they'd probably come from the killer's car. But who was this second woman? What was her name? Well, it turns out that identifying her would prove to be quite difficult. In fact, it would actually take weeks for the police to do this. There was nothing at the scene which gave them any indicator as to who she was, no ID or anything. They looked into missing people reports and none of them seemed to match this woman, and so they actually had to turn to her fingerprints in the end. They looked to see if her prints matched any prints that the police had in their records, and thankfully they did. About 2 weeks after her body was discovered, police were finally able to identify this victim as being 30-year-old Tracy Turner. The reason that her prints were on police record was because she had been arrested and convicted of relatively minor offences before, such as theft, and also offences relating to sex work. Just like Samo Paul, Tracy Turner also worked as a sex worker. Upon identifying her through her prints, police were able to track down Tracy's mother, and they discovered that she'd never actually been reported as missing. In those 2 weeks that she was unidentified, no one realised that she was missing, because from what I can gather, Tracy led the kind of lifestyle where she would often just disappear for periods of time. It would appear as though Tracy was a bit of a loner for the most part. She never really had that many friends, and heartbreakingly, the main reason that she actually seemed to be enlisted in sex work, police believed, was for company more than anything else. You know, most women who turn to sex work do so because they are struggling for money, struggling to provide for their families. But yeah, it's believed that in Tracy Turner's case, it was more so for companionship. She often felt lonely, and so she would try to befriend clients. Apparently, specifically, she would often go to motorway service stations where she would try to strike up conversations with lorry drivers that she could then go off with for a period of time. And in fact, the last time she was seen alive was at a service station. She was last seen at the Hilton Park services on the M6 motorway on the 2nd of March 1994, so just the evening before she was found dead. And Hilton Park services is around 50 miles away from Bitterswell, where her body had been dumped. Upon identifying Tracy as the victim, police were able to establish that the killer had stolen some of her belongings. I mean, as we know, she was found naked, so he'd stolen her clothing, but also what the police found out about Tracy was that she was deaf. She had to wear a hearing aid, however, her hearing aid was gone when her body was discovered, so it seemed like that had been taken by the killer, perhaps as a trophy. And something that forensics discovered, both at the scene where Tracy was found, and on Tracy's body itself was what looked like some little flecks or fragments of yellow paint. Apparently they were consistent with some sort of car respray paint, which again made police think of the development of the A14 road. Could the killer have been one of the workers there? You know, they were using yellow diggers and yellow trucks. Could this paint have come from one of them? Having said that, as I mentioned, tyre tracks were found at the scene, and experts who examined them informed the detectives that these tracks had most likely come from the tyres of a Citroen car, specifically a Citroen BX19. And again, unlike Samo's murder, police would have more luck in obtaining forensic evidence in Tracy's case. They were actually able to get traces of what they believed was the killer's DNA from her body. As I said, Tracy seemed to have been raped by her attacker, and traces of his semen were recovered from her body during her autopsy. Now, this semen was developed into a full DNA profile of the killer, but unfortunately, when the National DNA Database was later set up in England and it was entered onto there was no match, and so the police started taking DNA samples from a lot of the A14 workers and comparing them to the killer's DNA, but again, no match. Now, despite the fact that there were a lot of similarities between the murders of Samo Poole and Tracy Turner, you know, they were both young women, they were killed just 3 months apart, they were both sex workers, were both strangled, both of their bodies had been dumped along quiet country roads in Leicestershire just 5 miles apart, they were both discovered in locations near to the motorway network, the M6 and the M1. Despite all of these similarities suggesting that they were probably killed by the same individual, the cases weren't actually kind of officially linked by the authorities, because whilst there were similarities, there were also some differences too. For example, Samo disappeared from a red light district, the city centre of Borsall Heath, whereas Tracy vanished from a service station. There was also the fact that in Samo's case, police received information that her killer likely drove a brown-coloured Ford Sierra, whereas in Tracy's case, the tyre tracks indicated that the killer drove a Citroen BX19. And it was because of these differences that police ultimately decided that they weren't going to connect the crimes. They were going to investigate these murders as 2 separate inquiries rather than one joint investigation. And each inquiry was actually being handled by a different police force. As we know, Samo's case was being investigated by the West Midlands police, and Tracy's case was being investigated by the Leicestershire police force. I think detectives always kind of had it in the back of their minds that they might have been looking for the same man in relation to these 2 murders, but for the time being, like I said, they were 2 completely separate investigations, which I think a lot of people have since cast judgment on, to be honest. A lot of people felt like they should have been linked right from the beginning, but alas, they weren't. And tragically, as it would turn out, neither police department would have any luck in tracing either Samo's killer or Tracy's killer, and both cases, both crimes, ultimately ended up going cold. Now, a couple of years after the killings of Samo Poole and Tracy Turner, in 1996, a big investigation across 26 police forces in Britain was launched called Operation Enigma, to specifically look at several unsolved murders of sex workers, because prior to this, the police and the authorities had kind of come under fire for the fact that they were pretty ineffective at finding the killers of sex workers. And this was partly their fault, and also partly the fault of the media and the general public, to be honest. You know, back then, people's attitudes towards sex workers who had been murdered was just horrendous, because people just didn't have any sympathy for them whatsoever. They were just judged for what they did as a job. They felt as though it was a sex worker's own fault that they had been killed because they were willingly putting themselves in dangerous situations every night. So there was just no care, really. Detectives had less sympathy, and again, so did the public. So murders of sex workers received way less attention and way less media coverage than cases of other women who had been killed, meaning that, again, the majority of their murders just remained unsolved. That was until 1996, when, like I said, Operation Enigma was set up, whereby police forces across the country reviewed and reopened the unsolved killings of up to 207 sex sex workers, or women who may have been mistaken for sex workers, dating all the way back to 1986. They hoped that recent advancements in forensic science might finally crack some of the cases, and they began looking more into the possibility that some of these murders may have been linked. They may have been committed by the same person. Perhaps they had a serial killer or several serial killers on their hands who were specifically targeting women who enlisted in sex work. And two cases that were looked into as part of Operation Enigma were that of Samo Paul and Tracy Turner. And I think it was the launch of this operation when finally the authorities concluded that Samo and Tracy's murders were probably connected after all. They probably had been killed by the same man, and perhaps other sex worker murders that had happened in and around the East and West Midlands were also linked. It was following Operation Enigma when the name the Midlands Ripper started getting thrown around in relation to Samo and Tracy's killing specifically. So finally they started investigating them more so as a joint inquiry, and thankfully the cases wouldn't go fully cold once again, as 2 years after the launch of Operation Enigma in March of 1998, there was a major development when detectives were informed that a DNA match had just been made to the DNA of Tracy Turner's killer, the DNA that was collected from her body during her rape kit. The match was to a man named Alan Kite. He was around 34 years old by this point in 1998, and his DNA had recently been entered onto the National DNA Database because of a crime that he committed about 3 months prior in a town called Weston-super-Mare, which is located in Somerset in the southwest of England, about 146 miles away from Leicestershire. In December of 1997, Alan Kite was living in Weston-super-Mare. He was living in a hostel there, and one night he got chatting to a woman who was also staying in the hostel. From what I can gather, she was actually there because she'd fled a domestic abuse situation that she was previously living in, so she'd kind of come to this hostel to seek refuge. Anyway, one night in December of 1997, Alan Kite got chatting with this woman from the hostel, and they decided to go out for a drink together, which they did. They went out for several drinks actually. They also went clubbing, and this woman thought that Alan Kite seemed really nice. He just seemed like this nice, friendly, charming guy. But that all changed when they returned to the hostel later that night. When they got back, Alan Kite's charming and friendly demeanour suddenly switched into something far more sinister, and he actually proceeded to attack this woman. He grabbed a knife, threatened her with it, and then he proceeded to rape her. He raped this woman at knife point and even threatened to kill her during this attack. After the rape, Alan Kite fell asleep next to his victim, and luckily that was when she managed to escape. She told the warden of the hostel what had just happened to her, and they contacted the Avon and Somerset police, and Alan Kite was arrested. Following his arrest, his DNA was taken as required by law, and it was entered onto the National DNA Database, and as we know, that is what led to the DNA match being made. A couple of months later, in March of 1998, Alan Kite's DNA flagged up as an exact match to the semen recovered from Tracy Turner's body. Police had found Tracy's killer. So just for a quick rundown on him and his background, Alan Kite was born on the 7th of July 1964. He was originally from Staffordshire in the West Midlands of England. That's where he was born and raised. I couldn't find a huge amount of information online about his childhood, other than the fact that he apparently had quite severe asthma, so he was often quite sick and therefore very much doted on by his family. He was described as always being a bit of a loner, and upon leaving school and entering adulthood, he often went from job to job a lot before eventually settling into a career as a lorry driver, a van driver who would travel across the country for work via the motorways, which immediately stood out to the police when the DNA match was made, because as we know, they had always suspected that the man responsible for Samo and Tracy's murders was a van driver, given the motorway network that connected the crime scenes in Leicestershire. He had been arrested a couple of times before. Apparently he had a few convictions for petty theft related offences. And another thing about Alan Kite, he seemed to have a hatred for women. Not sure if there was any particular reason for this, but he was just known to despise women, all women, which seems very telling, doesn't it? Now, interestingly, Alan Kite was actually someone that had been briefly looked at in the original investigation into Tracy Turner's murder back in 1994. You see, just 2 days after Tracy was killed, a woman who worked in a petrol station in Birmingham reported to the police that she had just had a very, very strange encounter with a man who had just come into the petrol station. She said that this man came into the station pretending to be a reporter. He claimed that he was a reporter, but it was very, very obvious to her that he wasn't. And he started asking her just very odd questions about the recent murders of both Samo Poole and Tracy Turner, which had been on the news. He asked questions like, had she seen the women before? Had they ever come into the petrol station? Just really, really bizarre things like that. And the worker just had a really bad feeling about this man, and so she decided to report this to the police at the time, just in case maybe he could have had something to do with the killings. And she was actually able to give the police the license plate of the car that he was driving. She wrote it down as he was leaving. So police did some digging and they learned that that man, that reporter, was Alan Kite. He was the one who was pretending to be a journalist and asking strange questions about the victims. So police did look into him at the time. They did interview him. However, he denied being the killer. I think even denied being the fake reporter. And I guess police had no solid evidence to link him to the crime, so they quickly moved on, meaning that he was able to slip through the cracks. But fast forward to 1998, the DNA match had been made and Alan Kite was now the prime suspect in both the murder of Tracy Turner and the murder of Samo Poole. Yes, they didn't have any forensic evidence linking him to Samo's killing, but as we know, police had connected the murders by this point, so they still believed that he was responsible for her death too, and so they began looking for more evidence against Alan Kite to build their case against him. They started conducting searches of previous addresses that Alan Kite had lived at. Apparently he would move around a lot, often stay in different hotels and hostels, mainly around Staffordshire. So police searched these places, these addresses, for any evidence, although they didn't really find anything significant, to be honest. And so they began trying to see if they could somehow link Alan Kite to the murders via the vehicles that police believed the killer of Samo and Tracy had driven. So we know from the tracks at the Tracy Turner crime scene that the perpetrator likely drove a Citroen BX19, and we also know from that witness who reported having seen what she believed was Samo Poole's dead body in the back seat of a vehicle a few days after she was killed, that her attacker drove a brown-coloured Ford Sierra. And there was also that other report from another member of the public who said that she had seen a man trying to drag a woman into a brown-coloured car in the Borsal Heath area where Samo vanished from. Now, something that the police discovered about Alan Kite was that he would often drive various different cars because apparently he would sometimes work as a mechanic. He was very good at doing cars up, and whilst he was fixing people's cars, he would use them. He would drive around in them without their knowledge, of course. And upon looking further into Kite's movements in March of 1994, the month that Tracy was killed, police discovered that Kite was using a Citroen BX19 at the time, the exact type of car that had made the tyre tracks. But that wasn't all. Going back to the brown Ford Sierra that had been seen at the Samo Poole crime scene, as we discussed earlier, the woman who reported the tip of the man trying to drag a woman into a brown car was able to give the police the first 3 digits of the license plate. Now, police were able to establish that sure enough, at the time of Samo's murder, Kite was driving around in a brown Ford Sierra, and the first 3 digits of the license plate from the Ford Sierra that he drove were the same same ones that the woman had given them back in 1993. So following all of this, following the DNA match, the detectives approached Alan Kite for an interview. They wanted to interview him about the murders. Although prior to the interview, they carefully came up with a strategy as to how exactly they were going to speak to him. They decided that they were going to conduct what's known as a phased disclosure interview, whereby they wouldn't reveal to Alan Kite straight away the evidence that they had linking him to these crimes. They wouldn't immediately jump in and say, we know that you committed these murders, we've got DNA evidence. Instead, they would start their interview by just asking him about him, to be honest. Asking him about his life, his jobs, his movements around the time of the killings, what kind of vehicles he drove, just to kind of build up his trust, I guess. Almost speak to him like he's a friend or an acquaintance so that his guard wouldn't be up. And then gradually, as he's answering all of these questions, police could see if they could catch him out anywhere, and then they could slowly reveal to him the evidence that they had which linked him to these killings. So yeah, the interview started. They began asking Kite just rather mundane questions about himself, and he seemed very happy to talk initially. He was very cooperative. They got on to asking him what kind of car he owned or drove in December of 1993 when Samo Poole was murdered, and he admitted that he drove a brown coloured Ford Sierra. They also eventually asked him if he had ever used sex workers before. Now, this was before they revealed to him that they had DNA linking him to the Tracy Turner case. They wanted to ask him that question before they revealed that, because if they went straight in and said, we recovered your semen from Tracy Turner's dead body, his immediate defense probably would be, well, I paid her for sex. She was a sex worker and I paid for her services, so that's why you would have found my DNA. Doesn't mean I killed her. But if he was unaware that they had his DNA and he denied using sex workers, well, that would be him caught out, wouldn't it? That would be the jackpot moment for the detectives. And in the end, that is exactly what happened. They asked Kite if he had ever enlisted the services of a sex worker before, and he was adamant that he hadn't. He'd never paid for a sex worker, never done anything like that. In fact, he actually appeared quite angry at that question. He was offended that the police were asking him that, almost like the thought of it disgusted him. How dare they suggest that he used sex workers? And so it was following this when police finally confronted him with the evidence that they had linking him to the murders of Samo Poole and Tracy Turner, particularly the DNA evidence, the fact that his DNA had been recovered from the body of Tracy. And detectives said that he was just absolutely shocked when they announced this. He couldn't believe it. Clearly couldn't believe that he had been caught. But he denied it, denied any involvement in either killings. However, his denial ultimately didn't matter. The police still went ahead and they arrested and charged Alan Kite with double murder. The murders of Samo Poole and Tracy Turner. When it came to his court proceedings, the denial continued. He pleaded not guilty to the charges, and so he was headed to trial. He went to trial at Nottingham Crown Court in February of 2000. During the trial, the prosecution presented their evidence to the jury. They talked through the DNA match. They actually revealed that the chances of the DNA on Tracy's body belonging to anyone other than Alan Kite was 1 in 33 billion. And there are only 8 billion people on the planet, so that's a pretty positive identification, isn't it? But that alone didn't make the prosecution's case a strong one. You see, they also had a couple of witnesses come forward who claimed that Kite had confessed his crimes to them. These witnesses were fellow inmates of his. Of course, after he was arrested and charged, he was remanded in custody before his trial. And a couple of people that he was locked up with testified during the trial that he had admitted to them that he had murdered both Samo Poole and Tracy Turner. In fact, he was even kind of boasting about them, as if to him they were something to be proud of. According to one source, he told one of these inmates that the reason he killed Tracy was because she had laughed at him for some reason during sex, and this just caused him to snap and he strangled her to death. But not only did Kite confess to those two killings, his fellow inmates testified that Kite claimed to have been responsible for for even more murders too, that he'd killed as many as 6 women in his life, which police had suspected, to be honest. He was on trial for 2 murders, but the authorities did strongly believe that he'd probably committed more, but they just didn't have the solid evidence to prove it, to prosecute him for any other crimes. But it is strongly believed that he did have other victims. As part of Kite's defense during the trial, he last minute completely changed his original story. As we know, he initially claimed to the detectives that he had never used sex workers, that the thought of it disgusted him. But now, during the trial, he tried to explain away the DNA evidence by saying just that actually he'd lied. He did used to enlist sex workers, and that he must have paid Tracy Turner for sex shortly before she was murdered, and that's why his semen was recovered from her body, but he was still adamant that he hadn't killed her. However, the jury did not believe him, and at the end of the trial, they reached a unanimous verdict of guilty. Alan Kite was guilty of both killings, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum tariff of 25 years. And this sentence would run, I believe, after his sentence for the Western Supermare rape he was arrested for. He was convicted of that crime prior to his trial for Samo and Tracy's murders, and for that he received an 8-year sentence. Alan Kite has tried to appeal against his conviction and his sentence a couple of times over the years, but these appeals were rejected. And then in 2023, so just a couple of years ago, Alan Kite faced the court again, accused of the prolonged sexual abuse of a little boy, a child, which began back in the late 80s. I believe this boy lived close by to Kite in Staffordshire in the late 80s, and he was just 9 years old when the abuse started. One day, Kite lured this 9-year-old boy over to his house by promising him some toys, and once he was inside, he attacked him. He both physically and sexually abused him. And this abuse continued for 5 whole years, with each attack getting progressively more violent. The victim claimed that Kite would kick him, punch him, strangle and choke him, and also rape him. He was raped by Kite on a couple of occasions, but he never told anyone about this at the time because Kite would threaten him. He would threaten to kill both him and his family if he ever told anyone what he had done, and so out of fear, his victim stayed silent, and he remained silent for years and years until at some point in his adulthood when he finally felt as though he had the strength to go to the police. And in 2023, Kite went to trial charged with 11 separate offences relating to this abuse. The charges ranged from buggery to gross indecency, indecent assault and attempting to strangle a child. Kite denied it, of course he did. He pleaded not guilty, but regardless, he was convicted of these charges, and for this crime he was given another life sentence with a minimum term of 10 years and 8 months. Had it not been for that conviction, Kite would have become eligible for parole this year, actually in 2025, for Samo and Tracy's murders, but now as it stands he will not become eligible until at least 2033. But let's just hope and pray that no parole board decides that he will ever be fit for release, because I mean clearly he is just a huge threat. He poses such a huge risk to both women and children. Again, the police and the majority of people, I think, do strongly believe that Alan Kite has way more victims, that he's committed way more crimes and murders than the ones he's been convicted of, but as of today there just still isn't that solid evidence to be able to prosecute him for any other offences. But do let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. Do you think that he had more victims, or do you think he's just responsible for the 2 murders that he was found guilty of? And that brings us to the end of this case. That concludes the cases of Samo Paul and Tracy Turner and Alan Kite, the Midlands Ripper. Again, do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them down in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!